Welcome to this tutorial. In this tutorial I want to talk about CSS Grid. So we discussed about the flexbox in my previous video. If you have not watched that video, you can go to my YouTube channel and also watch that video on flexbox. So CSS Grid and flexbox, these are modern technologies that are used in page layouts. Like I mentioned earlier in my previous tutorial, I said that CSS provide four ways to align, or four ways to come up with the page layout. We talked about the float, we talked about the inline block, and we talked about the flex box, and then today we are going to talk about the last mechanism for page web page alignment or layout. We call it CSS Grid. Now every time you talk about the CSS Grid, basically it's a straightforward way to divide a container into rows and columns. So those rows and columns, when they have been divided, when you divide your web page into rows and columns, they form what we call a grid. Now a grid is like giving a web browser instructions such as set the border, the body tag as a grid with 4 rows and 3 columns. So that is an instruction that you can give to your web browser. Another instruction that you can give to your web browser is that place the header element in the first row and make it span all the 3 columns. So that's another instruction you can give to your web browser. Another instruction is that place the nav element in the second row and make it span all the 3 columns. So that's another instruction. Place the article element in the third row, column 1 and 2. So you can see such kind of an instruction. So this instruction cannot be executed using the flexbox. It can only be executed using the grid. And even you can get some other instruction, like place the aside in the third row, column 3. So that's an instruction. Place the footer in the fourth row and then let it span all the 3 columns. So these are the instructions that you can be able to accomplish using the grid, and it is not possible for you to do that using other mechanisms. Let's dive in and see how you can be able to come up with a grid in a web page. Now a grid uses 2 categories of elements. One is what we call the grid container. So a grid container basically is the parent where you are going now to create other elements on top of them, on it. And in this particular case, when you talk about the grid container, you need to specify the number of rows and the number of columns that you need. So here you are going to specify the number of rows and the number of columns. Now inside the grid container, we have the second element called the grid item. So in the grid item, this is whereby it resides inside the grid container, and you need to assign you need to give it you need to assign to a specific part of the grid. So a grid container requires you to be specific. Where am I going to fit? Where am I going to reside inside this particular container? And you need to give us the row, you need to give us the column, and many other things as we are going to discuss. Now how do you set up a grid container? It's very simple. You just need to have the container name, and then you need to write display to be grid. Remember we talked about the flex, and then we said a flex is supposed to say that display flex, but in this case you're going to say display grid. Yeah. Then you go to the next one, you say how do you specify the grid columns and rows? So it's very simple, by the use of the keyword grid template. So a grid template is the one that specifies the number of rows and columns you want in your grid. Yeah. Now in this particular case, you can see here we have the syntax of how the grid template look like. So a grid template is a combination of both the rows and columns. But if you want to be specific how many rows you want to create and how many columns you want to create, then you're going to use the property as shown below in this syntax here. So you're supposed to be specific: grid template columns, grid template rows. So that is how you are supposed to go about it, and give us the value of the rows and columns that you are going to create. Now what are these column values and row values? These are the space separate list of the sizes you want to use for each column or grid or row in your grid. So these column values and rows, they are sizes. Yeah, and when you talk about sizes in CSS, you mean these sizes. We have got the pixels, we have got the EM, we have the REM, we have the VW, and then we have the you have the VH. And you can as well be able to apply percentages, and also you can apply the keyword auto, which tells the browser to automatically set the size based on the other values you specify. So those are the CSS measurements you are going to see us using every time we talk about the grid template, row or column. Yeah. Now when you go to, this is an example of the program that was written to implement the grid. Now you can see here we have the source code whereby we have the div class of container, and then inside this particular div we have got other divs. Yeah, inside this particular div we have other divs, and therefore when you go to your CSS, you realize that we are going to specify that this is how I want this grid to look like. Yeah, I want it to have column that the first column is supposed to be 100, 300, and then 200, and then the rows are supposed to be 100 and 200. Okay, now in this particular case, you have said, for example, I've said earlier that this column is going to be awarded based on the number of items, but in this case we have 6 items. Yeah, and that we need to fit in this particular case, but in this case we have only 3 columns. So what is going to happen in this case? Now by default, the web browser will be able to assign numbers to these grid items. So it's going to give the first item number 1, and then the second one number 2, and the third one number 3. Then it will jump back to the beginning of this particular column. So it will go back, it will something like wrapping, it will wrap these columns in these 3 these grid items in these 3 columns. So when it reaches 3, it will go back to 4, 5, and then 6, and then you can see it has been aligned down here the way it is going to appear. The same applies to the grid rows. So we have only 2 rows. The first one is 100, and then the second one is 200. Yeah, so those are some of that is how the grid is supposed to look like. When you go to the next slide, apart from the CSS measurements you have been talking about in the previous slide, these measurements that you have been talking about in the previous slide, there is also another new measurement that you can use. We call it a fraction, FR. So a fraction basically is a fraction of the free space available in the grid container. Yeah, it takes up a fraction of the free space available in the grid container, either horizontally or either vertically. Now if we have an example, if you assign one column 1 FR of space and another 2 FR, the browser gives 1/3 of the horizontal free space to the first column and 2/3 of the horizontal space to the second column. So it's very simple. So what is going to happen in this case, we have divided the column, the column, yeah, the width of that web page into 2 columns. That is, the first one is 1 FR, and we have said that FR stands for the fraction of the free space. Yeah, so in this particular case we are going to take 1 plus 2, it is going to give us 3. So the total width of this is 3, and therefore if you want to take the fraction of 3, it's supposed to be 1/3 of the free space. So the first column is going to take 1/3 of the free space, and the second column is going to take 2/3 of the free space. So that is how the FR can be used in this case. Now by default, the web browser does not give spaces, horizontal spaces, to these columns or rows that you have created. So there is need for us to explicitly indicate the gaps that we want in our grid. Now in order for you to add spaces, you are supposed to use what you call grid column gap. Grid column gap is going to give us the spaces between the columns. Then when you talk about grid row gap, it is going to give us the spaces between the rows. in your grid container. Yeah. And then down here we have the example. We have the syntax here of how it goes about, and then here we have the example. So for example, in this case, you are setting the grid column gap to be 10 pixels. So the distance between one column and the other is 10 pixels. And then the second one, we say 15 pixels. So the distance between one row and the other is 15 pixels. Yeah. Now, this is sometimes, when writing these rows and columns gaps, it sometimes takes much of the processing speed of your computer, and therefore there is need for us to apply a shorthand property that will be able to capture both. And this is what we call the grid gap. So if you write just the grid gap, yeah, so in the grid gap you are allowed to combine the column gap and the row gap in this order. So you need to start with the column gap value, so you give it our 10 pixels for example, and then you have the row gap value that is 15 pixels. So you have been able to capture both in a single line of code. Now you can as well assign grid items to rows and columns. Yeah, so take control of the process and assign your grid items to specific rows and columns. So we said one of the strengths of grids is that you can be able to specifically tell where the grid item is supposed to be placed. Now in this particular case, for you to do that, you need to come up with this particular syntax. So that is, you need to start with the grid column start. So when you talk about the grid column start, basically you are specifying the column where the item begins, the column in which the item begins, in which column. Now you also need to specify the column end, in which column does this particular item ends. Now for example, if the grid column end is set at 4, then it means that the grid item ends at 3. So you need to give a value higher. Yeah, so where it is going to end, for example it is ending at 3, you need to give the end as 4 so that it can be able to capture that that column. Then grid row start, where is it going to start, in which row is it going to start, and then you also need to have grid row end, where is that particular row going to end. Now for you can use the keyword span followed by the space, and then you put the number of rows that are going to be affected in this case. Yeah, so if I write that span and then space 2, it means that how many rows are going to be affected by this item. Yeah, if I put span and then put that 3, how many rows? The rows that are going to be affected are 3. Now here we have an example of a code that we have got the divs, the container, it has got 6 grid items. Now the CSS here, this is where the magic takes place. Now we have got the grid, which is a grid, which is the container is the div, and then we are having the grid, and then you are specifying that this grid template column repeat. So repeat basically is a function that tells us that these columns, we have got 5 columns for example, all of them, they are going to have the same size. That's why we are saying we're having repeat into bracket, we have 5. So this means that we are going to split our website into our web page into 5 columns, and each column is supposed to have 100 pixels. It's supposed to be 100 pixels large, wide. Yeah, so you say grid template row repeat 3. So there are 3 columns or three rows. In these 3 rows you're supposed to give each 150 pixels. So a repeat function basically is just to help us to reduce rewriting each and every code. Yeah, rewriting the same things multiple times, just by giving us the function repeat, and then you give us the number of columns or the number of rows that are going to be affected, and then give us the size of that particular of those particular rows and columns. The first item is starting from number 1 and then it ends at 3. So this means that it's going to run from 1 to 2. So the first item is here. Yeah, so this is the first item, so it is starting from the first column. This is the first column and is supposed to end in the second column, but you can see we are using the third column. Yeah, so by using third column means that it is supposed to run from 1 to 2. Then the row is supposed to start from 1 and then it is ending to 1, so it is just within the same row. And then you go to the next item like that. Now, but the basically thing I want to show you is the span thing. So here in the second one, they're saying that the grid column end span 3. Yeah, so you go to this item 2. This is the item 2. This item 2, they're saying that it starts from column 3. So this is the column 3. This is where it is starting from. This is the column 3, and then it is supposed to span 3. So it is going to run through the remaining part. So remember we said earlier that we have 5. Yeah, so we have got 5 columns. So already one is taking one column, the first column and the second column. Now this second column, this particular 2, is supposed to span through the 3 remaining columns. It's supposed to span through the 3 remaining columns. That's why we are saying span 3, so that you can both to take all this part. I hope that is well understood. Then we have the grid row start 1. So the grid row starts 1. So the same row, we have the first row, and then it also ends in the same row. Then item 3, it's here. Item 3 is here. So it starts from the first column and then it ends in the same column. Yeah. Then you go to the second the part. We say that the grid starts from the grid row starts from 2, and the end it ends. So when I write end, basically it runs up to the end of that grid vertically. Yeah. So by doing that, it means that you have specified that this particular item is supposed to span through, or is supposed to run up to the end of that particular grid vertically. Then you do the same for the second one, that is the 4. 4 basically starting in the second row, and then it is also spanning. The column ends at 4, starting the column at 2 and then ending it at 4, and then it is starting the row at. So this means that when it says that starting at 2 and ending at 4, it means that it's starting from 2 and ending at 3. Yeah, we have already been told this, and I have explained it earlier, and I've said that every time you see the column end to be 4, it means that it is starting from 2 and then it ends at 3. So we pick the highest number, which is 4. Then the grid row start 2. The row starts at 2 and then it goes up to the end of that grid vertically. Then you go to this particular part now, number 5. Now in the number 5, we are saying that grid column starts at 4. Yeah, start at 4. The grid column start at 4, and then the grid column spans 2. So starting from this 4 up to the end is supposed to span the 2 columns that are remaining. Yeah, it is going to span through the 2 columns that are remaining. Then we also need to span to have the row starting at 2 and then it ends at 2. And then we have this one, the next one, whereby we have the last one. We have it starting from 4 and then it is ending at it spans through the remaining 2 fractions. So 2, what does it mean? It means that it's going to take 4. It is going to take starting from 4, then it's supposed to span 5 and then 6. So inside here we have got 2 spaces. We have 2 columns remaining, so it is going to span the 2 spaces that are remaining inside there. Yeah. Now the next thing that we want to look at is that we are going to have the last the part where you have the rows, and then you are saying that the row is supposed to span through 3 and then it also end at 3. So this is exactly what is happening in this particular case. So this is just a simple way to explain those aspects that you have talked about. The display, we have talked about the display. We have also talked about the grid template column. We've talked about the grid template rows. You specify the column sizes and the row sizes, and then when you come to the grid items, you are supposed to specify where is it starting from and where is supposed to end. And in case there is an overlap, you are supposed to use the word span and give us the number of rows and columns that are going to be affected by that overlap. So that is basically what we have been talking about in this particular case. Now a function repeat, I've already explained that it specifies the multiple columns and rows that are using the same size. I've already talked about that, and here we have the syntax. This is an example to explain that, and I've already explained that in the previous section. Aligning grid items. So it is very important. In order for you to have an outstanding web page, you need to know how to align grid items. Now the syntax for grid item alignment is here, whereby you need to have the justify item. So justify item is like whereby you are going to align the content horizontally. So that is the alignment horizontally of the grid item. And then when you talk about the start, you are talking about the left. When you talk about the end, you're talking about the right. When you talk about the middle, you're talking about the center. And then when you talk about stretched, then you are saying that across the width of the item. So these are the 4 values that you can be able to apply in this property of justify items. So you talk of start, it means something. You talk about end, you mean right. You talk about center, you mean middle. You talk about across the width, you talk about stretch. Now stretch is the default value. So if you don't specify it to be to have start or end, so by default the web browser will be able to align your content horizontally using stretch. Then we have align items. So align items basically is meant for the vertical alignment, and then vertical alignment also uses the some values like start, which means top, end, which means bottom, center, which means middle, and then you mean stretch, which means across the height of the item. So these are the 2 properties that can be used to align the grid items in your web page. Now that is the alignment. This, when you talk about the grid container, this, just to be clear, now justify item and align item, they are used for grid containers. Yeah. So every time you talk about the grid container, you use these 2 properties. You use justify item and align item, and I've already discussed that into details. But when you go to the grid item, when you go now to the grid item, you use the word justify self and align self. Justify self and align self. Yeah. So these 2 items, these 2 properties, that is justify self and align self properties, they are used mainly to align the grid item. But justify items and align items are used for grid container. I think that is well understood. Now the dimensions or the values that are used in this case are just what I've just explained in the previous slide, whereby you talk of the start, you talk of start, you talk of left, you talk of end, you talk of right, you talk of center, you mean middle, talk of the stretch, you mean across the width of the items. And then you go also to the align as self. So inside under align self, these are some of the dimensions that are going to be put in place. Okay, so those are some of the areas that you need to know as grid is concerned. Now let's dive into one of the example. We already did it in Flexbox, using Flexbox, but you want now to apply using grid, CSS Grid, and see if you can come up with the same output using the CSS Grid. Now let's go to our VS Code. In our VS Code, we have got 2 files. We have got the index HTML, and then we have styles.css. Now we are going to create this file. We are going to create this new file, doc type HTML. Yeah, then you go to head, title, and then the title can just say CSS Grid. Yeah, then you can go to again under maybe you can have this in one line, don't need to save space, so you can just have that in one line. And then we move to the next part, whereby we are going to discuss about talk of link. Let's create a link. Create a link, supposed to be in small letters, link. Then we have style sheet, then href. Then the file has already been created for that, and then we are going just to call it style.css, styles.css, like that. And then we go to the next line, body. Inside the body we have display. We have got the following items inside the body. So we have the header. Inside the header you can just write the word header, like that. Then you come to the second one. We have to come to the second item here. The second item here is nav. Under nav you can just say navigation. Then you go to the next part, article. Inside the article you can also say we have got article keyword. I'm writing it in capital letters as placeholders, article. Okay, then you move to the next one. We have aside. Inside the aside you can just write the word aside, like that. Then you move to the next part. We talk of the footer. Footer, you can just write there footer. Okay, so those are just placeholders. So this is just a simple website with all these features in there. Maybe I can just rewrite this. HTML. You can save this so that you can also be able to see what are some of the things that are going to be displayed. Now we have already created the link for the CSS, and then we are going to now to continue to the next part, which is our CSS. So in the CSS, that is where the magic is supposed to take place. We start with the first element. We talk of the body, and inside the body we are going to start with the first element, which is display, display, and then we say grid, and then you move to the next one, grid, and then it's supposed to be template columns. So template column is written here. One thing about this is that it gives you what we call an auto completion. So an auto completion means that you don't need to write everything. It will just automatically display to you the remaining text that you require, and if that is what you want, it will just allow you to double click on it. So you can see here we have the row, the grid template row. So I click on it, and then I can be able to specify the rows that I want. So 2.5 for the first row, rem. Then we also need 2.5 for the second one. Then we have one fr, and then we have the last one, we have the 2.5 rem. So those are the grid measurements. And then we also need the grid gap, So you can see by just typing, you can see whatever is being popped up here. Okay, so let me look for the grid gap. It's not saying here grid gap. Seeing, you can see it has been under there. So grid gap is there. Then you can just write 1 rem and 1 rem like that. Now we move to the next one. We have the mean height. The mean height is 100 VH. So basically 100 VH will allow you to span through the entire height of the web browser, leaving a very small or a tiny space, a small space of the browser. So that's why we are using 100 VH. Now after doing that, we are done with the first element. We go to the second element. We are going to style the second element, that is the header. So in the header section, we are going to use the grid column size. Okay, grid column it is going to start at 1 stroke end. You just write end. This basically, when you write like that, it means that it is going to start from the first column and then it's going to span through up to the end of that particular grid. Yeah. So you go to the second one. It say that grid row. Inside the grid row, we are going to, it's just going to span the first row. It's going to span the first row. So the border, we're going to put some borders around it so that you can able to see some difference between the 2 or 3. Okay, so black like that, and then you move to the next one, nav. Inside the nav, you have the grid column. So grid column is here, grid column, and then we have got 1 stroke end, yeah, like that. And then you move to the next one. We have the grid row. It's supposed to fit in the second row like that. Now we move to the next one, the border. I think the border is also similar to the one at the top, but you can just write quickly solid black. So that is it for the nav. Then you go to the article. Go to the article. Inside the article, we have the grid column. The grid column, we are using 1. It is supposed to fit in the first grid column. And then the grid row. The grid row, it is going to occupy the third row like that. And then we go to the next one, the border. So the border is just going to be 1 pixel solid black. 1 pixel solid black like that. And then you go to a side. We have got the grid column. Inside the side, we have got 2, and then we have got the grid row. Grid row is supposed to be 3. Where that particular part is going to be placed. That is the grid aside. Then we have got the border also. So in this particular case, you are just going to maintain the same border all through. So grid solid is supposed to be black like that. Then we go to the last item. The last item in this case, we are going to the last item we are going to write here is footer. So footer, we want it to have 1, and then it is going to span through the grid column. The grid column is here. The grid column is 1, then it's supposed to span up to the end. Then we also need to have the grid row. The grid row is supposed to occupy the 4th row. Then we also need to have the border again around it. So the border is supposed to be, we are supposed to have 1 pixel solid black like that. there's something that I need to mention before maybe we can display the output. Now, one thing that I want you to note is that you can see here we have been using one end. Yeah, we have been using one end is here, one end is there, so two end is there, and then we have that particular part here. So basically when you talk about one and then we have end, it means that this particular grid item will start from the first column and then span through up to the end of the grid. That is simply what that particular statement means. So if I say one and then I say stroke then end, it means that it's going to start from the first column up to the last, up to the end of the grid. And then the second, the same applies to this. Now when you talk about two then end, it means that this particular part is going to start from the second column and then it's going to run up to the end of the grid. So that is basically what I just wanted to ensure that we all are at the same position. Now if I run this program, it should give me that output that I have just I already displayed in my slides. Boom, there we have it. So you can see how it is it has been well aligned. It has been well aligned based on that question. You can see the way it is, and here we have that question. Yeah, so you can see how it has been aligned and the way it has been aligned in this particular output. So that is how you can be able to apply the grid in your web page, and that is how you can be able to have how you can be able to use the grid in your web page. Now if you are supposed to compare the two technologies, that is the Flexbox, and then you also need to compare it to the grid, the thing here is that it depends with the project that you are working on. It just depends with the project that you are working on, but these two are very important and it can be used in any project that you are working on. And which one are you comfortable with to use? Thank you so much for listening. Kindly click on the subscribe button to support me, and also you can turn the notification button on so that when I create another video, you'll be notified. Thank you so much. Bye bye for now.